بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Of course I would introduce in Arabic first.
تفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسرني أن نرحب بكم في هذا اللقاء أو المحاضرة الخاصة حول العلاقات السعودية الأمريكية، والتي سيتفضل بإلقائها الأستاذ توماس ليبمان. وتوماس ليبمان هو مؤلف وصحفي معروف مختص في شؤون الشرق الأوسط والسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية لفترة طويلة من الزمن، وهو وجه إعلامي معروف. عمل في السابق رئيسا لمكتب الشرق الأوسط في صحيفة واشنطن بوست، ومراسلا لشؤون النفط لنفس الصحيفة. وخلال التسعينات غطى ليبمان أخبار السياسة الخارجية والأمن القومي لصحيفة واشنطن بوست، وسافر مرارا إلى السعودية وبلدان أخرى في الشرق الأوسط. وفي عام 2003 عمل محررا رئيسيا للحرب في العراق للصحيفة، وصدر له كتاب عن تاريخ العلاقات السعودية الأمريكية، وسيصدر له قريبا كتاب حول تاريخ العلاقات العربية الأمريكية. وأترك المجال الآن لمحاضرنا ليتفضل، ولكن سأقدمه فقط في كلمتين في اللغة الإنجليزية. On behalf of King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, it's to my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Thomas Lipman, who would talk to us on Saudi-American relation. So the floor for you. تفضل.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. Good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for coming. I will begin by apologizing for not being able to do this in Arabic. I learned a great deal of Egyptian Arabic when I lived in Cairo so that I could order djaj mashwi and kharshuf at the market and the store, but I didn't learn enough to do this. So I'm going to speak English. I'll ask your indulgence. If I talk too fast, you can come up and kick my ankle and I'll slow down. And I hope that what I'll do is talk for a while about what I've learned. Many of you may know things that I haven't learned yet because there's information, I'm sure, in the archives of Saudi Arabia to which we have not yet had access. And on that note, let me say that I've now spent the past really 5 years in quite intensive study of certain aspects of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, historically and currently. And what I've discovered was that the standard narratives that you see in summary texts and history books are really very, I would say, superficial in this sense. The story of how two countries that were completely different in every way, Saudi Arabia and the United States in the 1930s, two countries that might as well have been two different planets. The story of how those two countries came together to forge a partnership and an alliance that, after many difficulties, continues to this day, is much more complicated and functioned on many more levels than I was aware of and that I think most people are aware of. And that's a little bit of what I'd like to talk about tonight. Certainly in American accounts, the two starting points, you might say, of the relationship were the discovery of oil by the Americans over in Dhahran in 1938, and the meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz that took place in Egypt in 1945. But in fact, those events did not just happen. They weren't random events. They followed a great deal of thought and discussion and conversations back and forth. I won't go in too much to the story of. There was competition, of course, for the oil concession here. Some British interests wanted it. And there were good reasons why the king chose an American company rather than a British company, which we can go into at great length. But let's take a look at the other keystone of the strategic relationship, which was the meeting between the king and the president that took place in 1945. That meeting followed 7 years of discussion and correspondence between the White House and the king and his advisors. The first time President Franklin Roosevelt ever engaged in communication with King Abdulaziz was in 1938, when the president received a letter from this king about whom he knew virtually nothing. It said, in effect, it said, Mr. President, we want to be your friends. Please don't give Palestine to the Jews. And this was 1938, which was really before there was any serious international discussion of what was going to happen to Palestine after the war. The war had just not started yet. And to me, it was a startling measure of how far ahead the king of Saudi Arabia was looking and what issues were on his mind at a time when he had a lot to do right here in this country. The king was a very busy man in 1938. And he wrote a letter to Roosevelt. President Roosevelt issued a polite, non-committal response because at that time, Saudi Arabia was not a matter of any concern for the United States. The strategic concerns for the United States at that time were the rise of Nazi Germany, the threat of Japan, the looming war in Europe, and the last years of the great economic depression in our own country. The president had a lot on his plate. There were a few Americans, a few hundred, in Tehran, in their own community, who were beginning to produce oil. But consider what happened after the Americans found oil in 1938. The first tanker of oil loaded for export at Ras Tanura sailed on the 1st of May, 1939. The king traveled to Ras Tanura to turn the ceremonial handle on the first tanker of oil in which he saw a bright future, economic future for Saudi Arabia. 6 months later, only 6 months, oil had barely started, Germany invaded Poland and World War II started. And as a result of the war, the export of Saudi oil did not increase, it stopped. It virtually stopped because the shipping lanes were closed and you couldn't get drilling equipment and electrical equipment and transportation equipment to move the oil. So that what should have been the first substantial flow of oil revenue to the kingdom was cut off by the war. At the same time, the war disrupted what was then the kingdom's other principal source of revenue, which was a tax on the Hajjis. Because of the war, very few pilgrims were able to come. And so now in the early 1940s, there was a terrible drought, so that people who lived on, the small number of people relatively who lived on crops and agriculture in Saudi Arabia were suffering because their crops were affected by the drought. So at the beginning of the 1940s, just at the time the United States entered the war, Saudi Arabia was a very poor country about which most Americans knew nothing, and it was not part of America's strategic vision of the world. Keep in mind that before the Second World War, the United States was almost unrepresented in the entire Arab world. Throughout Syria, Palestine, the Arabian Peninsula, and even North Africa, there were strong British and French interests. The Americans were almost unrepresented. This was not our part of the world. The war changed all that. First, because of the extreme poverty and suffering that the war inflicted on the people of Saudi Arabia, it became apparent to outside countries that the king needed financial assistance. Where was that financial assistance going to come from? It could have come from the United States, but the president in those early days, although he was interested in Saudi Arabia, said that the British should take care of it. This was a problem for the British. This was their sphere of influence. But that didn't last long, because it soon became apparent that the United States Navy and the United States itself after the war were going to need new supplies of oil. And the most promising place where that oil was going to come from when the situation stabilized was the place where the Americans had tapped into this great oil resource in Saudi Arabia. And so people who knew something about Saudi Arabia, and there weren't many, but Saudi Arabia's friends, began to persuade the president to think differently about what we should do, about what we Americans should do about Saudi Arabia. The oil people were very afraid that if the king who needed financial assistance got it only from Britain, that he would change his decision about who should have the oil concession, and he would take it away from Standard Oil Company and give it to British interests. So the oil company and the forces of the American Navy and President Roosevelt's wartime strategic advisors began to reposition their thinking about Saudi Arabia and whether we might find some value in a relationship with this poor and little-known country. And things happened very quickly from approximately the middle of 1942 up to 1945. The correspondence between the king and the president continued off and on. In the middle of the 1940s, as he began thinking about providing assistance and sort of coming to the aid of Saudi Arabia, Roosevelt sent various people to see the king and talk about how what would be involved, what could you do for us and what could we do for you. And those various envoys that the president sent all came back with pretty much the same message. He said, Mr. President, the king wants to be our friend. His country needs help. His country will have much to offer someday. And the one subject on which the king is completely inflexible is Palestine. So don't look to the king as a source of help on the Palestine question, but there are other ways in which we can do business together. At one point during the war, President Roosevelt flew to Tehran for a conference there. And on his way back, he flew over a large part of Saudi Arabia. And he basically looked out the window at Saudi Arabia. And as you know better than I, a lot of Saudi Arabia doesn't look like very promising farm country. But the president imagined that he saw places that he flew over where there was potential for irrigation and for mechanized agriculture to greatly increase Saudi Arabian agricultural output. And that's one of the things that he talked to the king about when they had their famous meeting. Around 1943, the United States is at war in Asia and in Europe. And what's about halfway between Europe and the China-Burma-India theater of war, Saudi Arabia? The United States military wanted an air base that would be strategically located, would be safe from German or Italian invasion, and would not be under British control. The British would not, for reasons best known to them, the British did not want the Americans to use their air base on Bahrain. And so the American military people wanted their own. So now you have a situation where Saudi Arabia is not so unimportant anymore. Roosevelt has been interested in the king for some time. The American military sees the potential for a strategic relationship based on putting the air base there, and people have begun thinking about where we're going to get oil that we're going to need late in the war and after the war. And people have also begun thinking about what will happen after the war when the British mandate in Palestine ends. And so the president and the king sent correspondence back and forth. As late as 1943, the only Americans in Saudi Arabia were the Americans at Aramco. There were no American diplomats. There was no official U.S. presence. I guess it was in 1943. The U.S. was represented by diplomats in Cairo who didn't come to Saudi Arabia. 1943, the president and his advisors saw the potential future importance of Saudi Arabia large enough that they established the first U.S. legation, first diplomatic mission in Jeddah. As I'm sure you all know much better than I do, during almost all his life as king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz had a struggle with certain people in his own country about allowing foreigners to live here. I mean, it was only 3 years ago that for the first time I read a detailed account of the Battle of Sabila and what was at stake in that battle for King Abdulaziz. I've learned so much in doing this work that I didn't know when I first started coming to this country. And so these were very sensitive issues for the king. How many foreigners were you going to allow here in the country, and on what conditions and under what terms? And in Jeddah, of course, from its days as the outward-looking pilgrimage port and center of Hajjis trade, in Jeddah there were a small number of foreigners at diplomatic missions, but otherwise the only foreigners, the only non-Muslims in the country were the Americans over in Dhahran. And the idea of putting a large foreign military base on Saudi territory was as difficult then as it was for King Fahd in 1990, maybe more so. Events moved quickly after that, and it was obvious from their discussion that the king and the president were coming towards some meeting of the minds about a joint relationship. The king learned from various people, including American visitors, that President Roosevelt was a stamp collector. And the king assembled a collection of very rare stamps from various places on the Arabian Peninsula and sent them to President Roosevelt as a gift. Just the sort of kind of thing that a far-sighted leader would do to introduce himself to some foreign leader whose attention he wanted to get. And so Roosevelt replied graciously for the gift of the stamps. And by the end of 1944, remember, all this time the United States is fighting the war with its allies, and Roosevelt was a very busy fellow. And Saudi Arabia was neutral in the war. Saudi Arabia was not an ally. Roosevelt wanted to do something to help the king and try to keep the king on our side after the war and do business with Saudi Arabia. Under American law at the time, the president could not provide direct financial assistance to Saudi Arabia unless he could testify to Congress that Saudi Arabia was an ally of the United States, which it wasn't, it was neutral in the war, or strategically important to the United States. And so I guess early in 1944, the president sent a notice to Congress declaring Saudi Arabia strategically important to the United States, and thereby making it possible for large amounts of equipment and goods to be supplied to Saudi Arabia as if it were part of our team in the war. One of the first things that the United States supplied under that program was enough silver bullion to make 3 million 1 real coins, because there was no paper money in Saudi Arabia in those days, and the king paid people and distributed help to his people by handing out coins. And in fact, the Arabian workers at Aramco were paid in coins because there was no paper money. So the Americans took the silver bullion out of U.S. stocks to the U.S. Mint, where they make the coins in Philadelphia, and made 3 million silver 1 real coins and sent them to the king so that he could give money to the tribes or to his family or whoever it was that he wanted to give money to. This began a process of a quite close relationship on many levels that escalated quickly. But still the president and the king had not met. And the first resident U.S. diplomat in Jeddah, a man named James Moose, was representing U.S. interests here. And about that time, one of President Roosevelt's envoys to the region had a meeting in Cairo with a gentleman named Hafiz Wahba, who was the Saudi Arabian ambassador in Cairo. And Hafiz Wahba told this American representative that the king also is very anxious to have a meeting, but your man in Jeddah, Mr. Moose, doesn't seem to be very enthusiastic. 3 months later, Mr. Moose was removed, and he was replaced by someone who was enthusiastic, namely Colonel William Alfred Eddy. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen the famous photographs of the meeting between President Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz. In many of those photographs, there's a man in a U.S. Marine Corps uniform who was their interpreter. That man was Colonel Eddy. He was already in Saudi Arabia because he was a native speaker of Arabic. He was born in Sidon, in what was then Syria, grew up. All his playmates as a boy were Lebanese Arabs. He spoke Arabic like one who grew up an Arab. And he was already in Saudi Arabia on a special assignment for the State Department. And so when Mr. Moose was removed, Mr. Eddy became the chief U.S. diplomat in Saudi Arabia. And it was his assignment to make sure that the meeting of the president and the king actually took place. Remember now that at this time there's been all kinds of correspondence going on about the future of Saudi Arabia, about financial assistance, about Palestine, about relations with Britain, about the oil business, so that the president had a good bit of information now about the king, and the king had a good bit of information about the president. And so in early 1945, the invitation went out to, back up. In 1944, the president invited the king to come to the United States. The king was unable to do so at the time, so he sent 2 of his sons. He sent Prince Faisal and Prince Saud to the United States. First real visit by Saudi Arabian people to the United States. And when they came home, they told their father that they had been well received and well treated. Vice President Truman gave a dinner for them at the official guest residence in Washington. They went across the country on a sightseeing trip on a special train. They went to San Francisco. They had a wonderful time in the United States, and they were well treated. And when they went home, they reported to their father that the Americans had been nice to them, and America was an interesting country. And the king only further stimulated the king's interest in having this meeting. So, to make a very long story as short as possible so that we'll have some time for discussion, in early 1945, the president sent a formal invitation to a meeting with King Abdulaziz. The president was going to Yalta for the famous Yalta conference with Churchill and Stalin. Yalta is in what was then the Soviet Crimea in the Black Sea. And so after that, he wanted to come down to Egypt, and he wanted to meet with King Farouk of Egypt, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. And everyone in the American side understood that the meetings with King Farouk and Emperor Haile Selassie were formalities, courtesy calls in effect. But in the meeting with King Abdulaziz, there were serious issues to discuss. And so the invitation went out for the king to come to Egypt to meet with the president. As far as I've been able to find out, except for the time he was in Kuwait as a young man, King Abdulaziz had never left this country since he had come back in the famous return from Kuwait in 1902 or whenever it was. He had certainly never been to Egypt, let alone Europe, you know. And for him to travel outside the country was a very important and serious decision which the people of Saudi Arabia had never been through before. They'd never known a time when their king, who had created Saudi Arabia, had left the country. And it required a great deal of diplomatic back and forth between the Americans in the person of Colonel Eddy and the king and his advisors about how the king would travel to Egypt and who would go with him. And some of these stories are actually quite amusing. And I try to tell them in a way that doesn't make fun of anybody. But King Abdulaziz was a powerful, strong, and what shall I say, self-confident person. And he assumed, whenever he traveled within his own country, he traveled with the large entourage of people who went with him, because wherever the king was, that was where they should be. And he assumed that when he traveled to Egypt to meet President Roosevelt, he would take the same kind of entourage under the same circumstances. But that was not going to be possible, because he was going to travel to Egypt aboard a relatively small American warship, a destroyer, the USS Murphy. And this was going to place certain restrictions on the size of the king's traveling party. He said he wanted 200 people to travel with him. The captain of the Murphy said, "Forget it, I'm taking 10. The king assumed that he could take some women with him. That was not going to be possible on a warship of the U.S. Navy. And the king also assumed that the king also insisted that he and his companions would eat only freshly slaughtered meat, and therefore he wanted to bring the sheep with him. This was not compatible with the way the U.S. Navy sails on its ships. At that time, they didn't have any women, and they certainly didn't have any sheep, live sheep, on U.S. Navy ships. It's actually quite amusing to read the accounts of the negotiations back and forth about the way this finally worked. But the thing to remember is that everybody wanted this to happen. And so at the end of the day, the king and Yusuf Yassin, his foreign policy advisor, and Abdullah Suleiman, the famous finance minister, agreed that they would that the traveling party would be only 24, plus the sheep. So when they showed up at the pier in Jeddah, they were 40, plus the sheep. And there was probably more negotiation over the meat than there was over the details of any agreement. And at the end of the day, the Navy agreed. The king insisted that the American sailors be his guests on the ship and dine with him and his men. He brought his Arab hospitality with him. Why would he not?
Minus women. Minus women.
Minus women. Minus women, absolutely. The Navy didn't want sailors to eat this mysterious food brought on board by people they didn't know from heaven knew what conditions these animals had been raised in. And so more compromises were struck. The Navy agreed to take 7 live sheep The rest were put back on the boat, lived to be slaughtered another day. And the sheep were indeed, for the king and his party, butchered right there on the USS Murphy for the king to eat. But the Navy, the captain of the Murphy told the king that the sailors would be imprisoned if they ate any food other than Navy regulation food. Remember that you have people here from two cultures that are completely unfamiliar with each other, trying to come together to do serious business under two powerful, far-seeing leaders, and yet all the logistical details were extremely difficult to navigate. And Colonel Eddy's account is quite amusing, actually, about how difficult it was to bring all this together. At the end of the day, the king assigned Prince Saud and Prince Faisal to take charge in his country in his absence. He told everyone that he and his caravan were going to Mecca. At the end of the day, they turned away from Mecca and went down to Jeddah, and the king and his traveling party got aboard the Murphy and sailed away. And there was a great deal of consternation and unhappiness among the people in Jeddah because this had never happened before. What had happened to the king? Had he been kidnapped? No one knew, because of wartime security restrictions, no details about this could be announced to anyone or made public. And so the king boarded the Murphy, and then really interesting differences arose, because the king's advisors said that the chairs from the Murphy's wardroom, from the officers' quarters, were not sufficient. The king had to bring his throne with him. He wasn't going to sit on those chairs that ordinary people sat on. The king also had infirmities of his legs. It was difficult for him to walk on hard surfaces, so that he brought with him a beautiful collection of carpets, which they spread around the deck, so that he could walk without pain. And then the Americans said, "Your Majesty, this is the room that you will occupy as our guest." The king said, "I'm not doing that." And he and his men slept outdoors on the deck, just as they slept outdoors as they traveled around the country. "Okay, Your Majesty, if that's what you want, that's what we'll do." And they sailed away, headed for the Suez Canal and the Great Bitter Lake. And one more important cultural issue to be resolved. Two, really. What would they do while it was going to take maybe 2.5 days to get up to Egypt? What would everybody do, since only Colonel Eddy spoke both languages? The sailors and the king's men could not talk to each other. Well, the answer was to show movies, which caused a certain amount of distress, because the Americans didn't want the king to know that his traveling companions were watching American movies with women in them down below decks. And the person who took care of that was Prince Mohammed bin Abdulaziz, who essentially told Colonel Eddy, "If you show movies down there and I don't get to watch them, your wife is going to be a widow." Colonel Eddy loved Prince Mohammed and thought he was a very amusing guy, but he also knew that he wasn't fooling around. So everybody except the king saw a documentary film about naval operations. Everybody else saw racy comedies shown by the Americans down there, and you didn't need to know English to know what these movies were about. So that's how they filled up their time. When the king arrived at the Great Bitter Lake, Roosevelt was waiting for him aboard a larger vessel, the cruiser USS Quincy. And I don't want to dwell too much on the details of their greetings and all that. The Americans were really at a loss. They didn't know what Arab people from the peninsula ate. They knew that the king wouldn't eat pork and that you couldn't smoke in his presence. But they didn't know anything else about his diet. What kind of food would he want? What to serve for lunch? They guessed. They faked it. The king and the president, though, it appears that these two men just hit it off. You know, sometimes you meet people and you like them right away, even if you don't know much about them. and you feel that these are people you want to know and be friends with. That's apparently what happened with these two men. And it's important to remember at all times that on paper, this was an unequal conversation. The United States was a powerful, industrial, rich, fully developed country. Saudi Arabia was none of those things. The force of the king's personality, the dignity, power, and self-confidence of the king's belief in his own authority were so strong that in effect it became a meeting of equals. And the discussions that followed because of the king's personality were discussions of equal men, two leaders of countries who came together on a basis that was not master and student. It was equals. And we have something that we can do for you. You have something that you can do for us, and we'll proceed on that basis. 5 hours of conversation between FDR and the king. Despite everything that he had been told by all his advisors, Roosevelt apparently believed that his charming personality would create some flexibility on the part of the king on the subject of Palestine. Roosevelt was wrong. They had a very interesting conversation on the subject of Palestine in which the king gave not 1 inch. In effect, told the president said that the question of what had happened to the Jews in Europe had become an urgent international issue, and Jews wanted to go to Palestine. And the king said, Mr. President, what happened to the Jews in Europe was terrible, but we didn't do it. You got a problem, you need a place to put the Jews. Don't take it from the Arabs. Take it from the people who are responsible for this. And although the conversation went on for hours, that was essentially the end of the discussion about the Palestine issue. That, of course, was the same Palestine issue that stands between our countries today. Right? And there was no easy solution then, just as there isn't now. The upshot of this meeting was that several things happened very quickly. The United States raised its commitment to financial aid to Saudi Arabia. The king declared war on Germany and Japan, and joined the alliance in the late days in the war. The king gave permission for the United States to build an air base, the same air base that you see today in Dhahran, now a Saudi base. Those negotiations were very difficult because the king insisted on maintaining Saudi sovereignty. Saudi flag had to fly. The king gave permission for the Americans to open an embassy branch or a consulate in Dhahran. And thus, where there were two countries that had nothing in common and no joint ventures at all, they suddenly became strategic allies. And as soon as the war ended and the oil revenue began to come in, the king began to commission development projects for the country, which obviously Saudi Arabia needed. Saudi Arabia needed roads, hospitals, electric power plants, hospitals, and all those things. And many of those contracts went to American companies, and Americans began to come into the kingdom to build all the things that Saudi Arabia needed. Now, that was the foundation of a strategic alliance that has had many variations and ups and downs, as you all know, in the years since then. There never was a bilateral agreement on the Palestine issue. President Roosevelt promised the king that the United States would not make any decision about Palestine without full consultation with both sides, i.e. the Zionists and the Arabs. And 2 months after the meeting, just a month before he died, the president restated that commitment in writing to the king. All of this is done without any notice in the media or any public attention at all. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt died, and President Truman brought a whole different set of ideas to the table. President Truman was interested in maintaining the partnership with Saudi Arabia, but he also was interested in finding some way out of the Palestine problem that would be politically acceptable when he ran for re-election in 1948. And I think it's fair to say that the king brought a very Arab perspective to Roosevelt's promise. To King Abdulaziz, the commitment of the country and the commitment of the monarch were the same thing. To the Americans, that wasn't the case. President Roosevelt had made a commitment, but he died. And now the country was in custody of somebody else. And the commitment of President Roosevelt was not the commitment of President Truman. And President Truman understood perfectly well that at the end of the day, on Palestine, one side would prevail and the other side would not. And so Palestine remained a cloud over the growing relationship all this time. And I don't want to go on too long, except to say that despite what happened in 1948, King Abdulaziz decided that the relationship with the United States was sufficiently promising, the oil revenue that the Americans were bringing in was sufficiently important, that he could not and did not wish to have a permanent breach in this new relationship over the Palestine issue. And he wrote a letter to President Truman that said, Mr. President, we deeply regret your decision to recognize Israel and accept the partition of Palestine, but there's nothing we can do about it now, and we wish to go on and pursue the bilateral relationship as best we can in other ways. And that was the key for a whole new set of American inputs that were brought in here, always with the King's permission and at the King's request, to try to help improve or to modernize the lives of the people of Saudi Arabia. At various times, various Americans wrote the charter for the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, introduced paper money, originally in the form of pilgrimage scrip. I don't see, there's some of you in this room may be old enough to remember the paper currency that was supposed to be good only for the pilgrimage, just for the Hajjis, and it soon became sort of de facto paper currency for the country. We sort of sneaked paper money into the country here. And the relationship, then the question was, what would happen to the air base, which obviously we didn't need anymore after the war? This was the last crucial point. The king was a really tough negotiator. He didn't give anything away. You wanted something from him, you had to ante up. At their meeting, as I'm sure you all know, the president gave the king two gifts. One was his backup wheelchair to help the king walk. The other was an airplane, a DC-3 airplane. The whole story of the gift, I mean, let me just abuse your patience for a minute and tell you that the Americans had long, long discussions in the State Department and the White House about what should be the official gift. And a lot of people said you should give the king a statue, a painting. Other people said, wait a minute. This is Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. We don't do statues. We don't do paintings. Right? Then you should give the king a Cadillac. The king already had a big fleet of cars. Right? So Roosevelt went the whole way. He gave him an airplane, which was flown over here by an American named Joe Grant. Mr. Grant is now, today, 99 years old. And last month, there was a ceremony at the Saudi Arabian Embassy in Washington honoring Mr. Grant as a friend of Saudi Arabia. I was privileged to attend that ceremony. He became the king's personal pilot and still speaks very fondly of him, although he does tell some naughty stories about the king.
Like what?
No, you're not going to hear them from me. The king understood the importance of aviation to a country the size of Saudi Arabia that didn't have any roads, and where some people were still not entirely happy with his kingship, shall we say. So he wanted an airline. And so the price of the air base was a commitment by the United States to essentially create an airline. And the result of that was that an airline known as Transcontinental and Western, later Trans World Airlines, or TWA, went to Dhahran, came into Saudi Arabia, and began the process of training Saudi pilots, Saudi flight crews, Saudi mechanics, training Saudi Arabia so it would have its own airline. And there were TWA people here for many years. TWA was created by a gentleman named Howard Hughes, and that's a whole story in itself. Howard Hughes turned out to be one of the most eccentric people in America, and a very, very odd figure. But TWA came in, and that was, the king said, you're going to have the air base. But now that we didn't need it anymore for military purposes, it became a center for training, for airline traffic, for TWA to fly the Cairo-Bombay route. And there were subsequent negotiations with King Saud after he succeeded his father about whether it would continue to have a military role, which is a subset of this discussion. And so now throughout the 1950s and the early 1960s, there were ups and downs in the relationship because of very complicated issues that involved the rise of Nasser, the war in Yemen. What role would Saudi Arabia have vis-a-vis Egypt and Yemen? Would the United States get involved in that war? And for one reason or another, some of it having to do with the, shall we say, unusual personality of King Saud, not much happened in terms of substantive economic development in Saudi Arabia or government development or public service development in Saudi Arabia until King Faisal succeeded his brother. That set off a whole new set of American inputs into Saudi Arabia, so that at one time or another, I have here a list of innovations which, for better or worse, Americans brought to your country. Some of them you might wish, like McDonald's, had never come here, but the list of things that didn't exist in Saudi Arabia before the Americans brought them, always under negotiated conditions, includes paper money, television, the brassiere, the baby stroller, mechanized agriculture, power tools, classroom education in non-religious subjects, air conditioning, mosquito eradication to get rid of malaria, limited access highways, and the latest one, for which I salute you, the wheelchair ramps in office buildings. All these are things that eventually your country would have acquired. It suited the purposes of the kings of Saudi Arabia to acquire them from Americans because he found Americans congenial and non-threatening. The United States had the same characteristics for your country in a way that China does today. Unlike Britain, we had no record of colonizing in the Middle East. We had no threat to Saudi sovereignty. We were a nuclear power, we were a large consumer of oil, and we had a permanent seat on the Security Council. That's the same description that applies to China today. And to my mind, is part of what accounts for your country's willingness to do more business with China as the relations with America change. The final event in this long, windy narrative here is the visit to this country by President Nixon in 1974, just before he was forced to resign by the Watergate scandal. He was the first American president to visit Saudi Arabia. And it's probably fair to say that Saudi Arabia was the only, by the summer of 1974, Saudi Arabia was the only country where Richard Nixon would still get a royal welcome. He was very well received. And the king, Faisal at that time, this was right after Saudi Arabia had finally lifted the oil embargo that was imposed during the 73 war. The king and the president reached an agreement to create what became known as the Saudi Arabian United States Joint Economic Commission. Both sides wanted something out of this. The Saudi government wanted American help in promoting the functions of the civil service, of government service, of learning functions of basic governance that hadn't existed in Saudi Arabia, such as how to take an effective, comprehensive census. The fact is, people don't grow up knowing that. You have to learn how to do that. What the United States wanted in the mid-1970s, when this country was getting serious, huge amounts of oil revenue, money was coming in so fast that Saudi Arabia couldn't spend it all. What the United States wanted was for as much of that money as possible to come back to the United States in the form of purchases of goods and services from the United States. And so President Nixon and the King set up the Joint Commission, and it lasted for 25 years until the end of Bill Clinton's presidency. And what the Joint Commission did was, Americans from the U.S. government came over here to Saudi Arabia. This went on for 25 years. And they worked directly in offices of the Saudi Arabian government alongside their Saudi counterparts, doing projects, learning functions, and issuing contracts for purchases and services. And of course, all those contracts went to Americans. It was a good way to send the money back home. A lot of people in the United States don't even know about this because Congress didn't put up the money. Your country paid for it. And it was a way to channel the money back in. Now, by that time, the Cold War was on. Saudi Arabia was a strongly anti-communist country, a strong ally of the United States in the region, and the relationship evolved from a very basic one of basic functions in life to one of a strategic alliance between two countries that look at the world the same way. And I would just say one last thing before my boss turns off the microphone here. I would say that one reason this relationship has succeeded as well as it has, despite all our differences, is that by and large, the Americans who came here to work and make money, or to fly the planes, or whatever they did, or to cajole Saudi Arabia into strategic arrangements, came here with a clear understanding that it was not the function of Americans to tell you how to organize your society. The King had spelled out the famous proposition that we will use your iron, but our faith is not your business. The King's terms were, the way we organize our communities, run our families, worship our God, raise our children, is not for you to tell us the way, let's say, certain other European powers had told people in certain other countries. I would say that by and large, Americans followed that rule. And it's one reason why they were able to maintain a good working relationship with a society as different as yours, which, by the way, in my opinion, has greatly benefited both countries and which I hope will continue to prosper. Thank you for your attention. And I'd be happy to engage in any form of discussion that you like.
Thank you. First, I have to tell you, you were a great storyteller. Right?
Well, I had 3 children. I had to tell them stories, you know.
So I would like to thank Mr. Lieberman for his detailed, informative presentation. And I would take your permission to relate a summary, if you have said, for the people in Arabic.
Please. It's your meeting.
Because some of them maybe they didn't follow us. استعرض ليبرمان تاريخ العلاقات السعودية الأمريكية، تفاصيل التفاصيل، وركز على مقدمات تطور هذه العلاقات، وفصل كثيرا في لقاء الملك عبدالعزيز مع الرئيس روزفلت 1945 ميلادية. ومعظم ما طرح تفاصيل، لكنه أكد أنها كانت أساسية لبناء علاقات استراتيجية بين البلدين استمرت حتى عام 1975 عندما دخلت العلاقات السعودية الأمريكية بطور تنظيمي مختلف من خلال اللجنة المشتركة، واستمرت هذه الاتفاقية إلى عام حتى رئاسة الرئيس كلينتون. والآن أترك المجال لبعض الأسئلة أو أسئلة عن بعض التفاصيل الأخرى. بذلك المجال مفتوح لكم لأي تعليق. We have a question from one of our friends, so you can.
Hi, it's wonderful speech, and you are really not a good storyteller. You are a good novelist as well.
I didn't make it up.
I have two short questions. One of them, when you mention that there was 3 million silver coins was sent to Saudi Arabia. I read once that one of these ships, I don't know whether it was sent by United States or someone else, was sinking in the Red Sea. The other question about the captain who was the interpreter between King Abdulaziz and President Roosevelt. Is there any book or did he leave any memories or something regarding, I mean, when he was living in Saudi Arabia and his experience with King Abdulaziz and this?
Well, let me address the second question first. I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
Is there any book that? What is it? What would this book be about?
The captain, I forget his name, who was in Saudi Arabia.
William
Colonel Eddie?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you should ask. I
Yeah.
just finished writing that book and delivered it to the publisher last week.
Good.
It will be available in February.
Yeah.
Be sure to buy many copies. There is a book about him. And in addition to his pioneering work in Saudi Arabia, he had spent a good part of the war in Morocco, where he was chief of the U.S. spy agency, the OSS, and he later was the man sent by President Truman to open U.S. relations with Yemen. He had a very interesting life. And he grew up in that Protestant missionary community in Lebanon that created AUB. And I just finished a story of his life, tells his whole story.
Good.
And I urge you to buy many copies when it comes out next year.
Please.
Now, the first question was, and I've gone on, so I forgot the first question.
No, about the ship was.
Oh,
was
yes.
sinking.
The question was about the shipment of the coins. This gentleman had heard that the ship was torpedoed. Well, I was trying to compress the story a little bit. There was a shipload of Saudi rials that was, in fact, torpedoed in the Gulf of Oman and sank. And I know about this because I have one of those coins. They were salvaged 30 years later in a diving expedition. So what had happened was that when that ship went down, we just did it again. I mean, the king's coins went to the bottom, so we had to mint 3 million more and send a second ship. But there was indeed a ship that went to the bottom carrying those coins. They're not there anymore. Don't go get them. Somebody brought them
I will
away.
not. Thank you very much indeed.
شكرا. I have تفضل أستاذ ضرار.
My name is Dirar. I come from Sudan, and I've lived here for the last 30 years. My question is this. I have got one or two questions. I have actually read some of Eddie's documents, secret documents, particularly on the meeting between the king and Roosevelt. And I find that according to what he says, he said that Roosevelt did not want Churchill to know about his meeting with the king, and he almost kept that as a secret from him. We would like to know what the reason was. The second thing is that Eddie again says that Roosevelt promised the king that the Jews would be repositioned in Poland because the Germans killed some 3 million people, some million Jews in Poland when they occupied it from the Russians, or half taken by the Russians and half taken by the Germans. And he said that, well, these Jews have lost their homes there, so they must be given back some of their homes which they lost. So I think that is also a problem. Another thing which I want just to say, the king wanted actually to have 100 sheep with him in the boat, as he said, and that is because he wanted to show that he is an Arab who is extremely generous to his guests, and that is why he wanted to take them. And I think he slept, you see, under the sky because he couldn't accept the small room of the shipmaster. Thank you very much.
That's probably true. You've actually done quite a bit of homework, sir. Let me take these just quickly.
Well, I didn't know you were going to talk about it, so
Right,
otherwise I
okay,
have waited
right.
for you.
I didn't go into the whole business about Churchill. While the king was in Egypt, he also had a meeting with Prime Minister Churchill, who had also been at Yalta. According to the American accounts of this, remember that King Abdulaziz, it's amazing how this man, who had never been outside the Arabian Peninsula, was able to manipulate the Prime Minister of Britain and the President of the United States by playing them off against each other. This went on for years. And basically he would tell the Americans, if you don't do it, we'll go to our friends the British. We don't really like them, but if you make us do it, we'll do it. And you know what he told the British? Gee, we really don't want to go to the Americans. You've always been our friends, but if we have to, we'll go to the Americans. And of course they both believed him. He was very good at this. The American accounts of the meeting say that Churchill was surprised to learn by accident that the king was going to meet the president, and had a last-minute scramble to try to arrange his own meeting, which he did get. And the king came back to Saudi Arabia on a British warship. But according to all the American accounts, the king didn't like Churchill. Churchill smoked cigars in his presence and was rude and arrogant. And the king didn't have as much fun on the British ship as he had on the American ship. So it wasn't a success for the British. The British naturally tell a much different story. According to the British accounts, it was Churchill who encouraged the king to meet Roosevelt in the first place. I don't know enough to know which is the true account, if either. On the question of relocating the Jews, right? Where would the Jews go, the ones who survived, right? All kinds of strange ideas were advanced. At one time or another, there was discussion in Washington, mostly, in Washington and in London, about Angola, Libya, big country, nobody there, back to Germany, pacified Poland, where so many of them had originated in the first place. The problem with all this was that there was no way the Jews wanted to go back to Germany and Poland, right? King Abdulaziz was not going to betray a different set of Arabs by saying, okay, send them to Libya. He had an obligation to them too. Nobody involved took Angola seriously, and besides, the Portuguese hadn't been consulted, right? And within the United States and in Palestine, the Zionists were demanding fulfillment of the Balfour Declaration. They wanted to go to Palestine. So that this was a difficult case, but there were all kinds of proposals offered about where they should go.
Thank you. I have a question here. Somebody asking about the state of current Saudi-American relations.
I wonder when we were going to get to that.
So, do you think that this relation would go back to its norm after the end of Bush presidency?
This is one of the many questions to which I would say, you know, there's a 2-minute answer and there's a 3-hour answer. And I'll try to give the short one. I don't believe the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia can or should be what it was in the past in this sense. Saudi Arabia is a grown-up country now. A lot of the things that you needed from outside in the past, you don't need from outside anymore. You fly your own airplanes. You teach your own schools. You pave your own roads. You staff your own hospitals with your own medical personnel. You don't need us to do any of that stuff for you anymore. You can hire contractors if you want. You can do joint ventures with Americans, like that big joint petrochemical venture that was announced yesterday. If you want to do it with somebody else, you can. The relationship of a combination industrial teacher and industrial supplier, no, you shouldn't go back to that. On the strategic front, I think things are not in a good state at the moment. I have no idea what Vice President Cheney and the King talked about yesterday. In fact, I don't even know what they talked about when Mr. Cheney was here last time in November, because nothing's ever really been made public about that. But I was very struck by the King's speech at the summit conference a few weeks ago, in which he said a couple of things about, first talking about the illegal American occupation of Iraq, which shocked everybody in Washington, although it shouldn't have, and about the need for Arab leaders to take matters into their own hands. And in my opinion, the reason the King said that was that he has seen, rightly, that we, the Americans, our policies, have not succeeded. We have not succeeded in containing Iranian influence or curtailing the nuclear program. We have not succeeded in modifying Syrian behavior. We have not succeeded in stabilizing Iraq. We have not succeeded in creating a state for the Palestinians, creating the two-state solution that we said we wanted. We have not succeeded in stopping the tragedy in Darfur. And as Prince Saud al-Faisal said in a very revealing interview with Newsweek, the King couldn't take it anymore. And when he saw the Palestinians of Fatah fighting it out with the Palestinians of Hamas, he saw his fellow Arabs on a destructive path from which the Americans could not lead them out, which is why he brokered the Mecca agreement. The King did what he had to do. I don't think Washington liked it. I think we've had difficulties in the relationship before. I hope we'll survive this one. At the moment, I think the mess in Iraq is dragging a lot of other things down with it.
just a minute. ممكن يا أستاذ تترجم ماذا قال بعض الأخوة الصحفيين يحتاجون إلى تابعته لهذه الفقرة؟ ممكن؟
نحكي عن العلاقات السعودية الأمريكية بشكل عام والأشياء اللي غير راضي عنها السعودية بالنسبة للسياسة الأمريكية في العراق مثلا، والوضع السيء في العراق، وإنه والاقتتال الفلسطيني اللي والملك عبد الله إنه رعى الاتفاقية بين الفلسطينيين، وهذا الشيء ما سر أمريكا، وعدا عن المشاكل الثانية اللي بالمجمل السعودية ما بتوافق أمريكا على سياستها في أمور ثانية.
وقال كلمة مهمة وهي أنه ليس بالضرورة أن تعود العلاقات السعودية الأمريكية إلى سابق عهدها، لأن المملكة السعودية وصلت مرحلة أن تعتمد على نفسها في كثير من المجالات. تفضل دكتور أسعد. As you like.
Thank you very much. My name is As'ad al-Shamlan. I teach political science at the Institute of Diplomatic Studies. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much, Mr. Lipman, for a very interesting, very intriguing presentation. I just want to comment on one small detail and then go to a different set of points. It seems to me, I might be wrong on this, but you said that King Abdulaziz, when he went to the Red Sea, it was the first time he left what we now call Saudi Arabia after he returned from Kuwait. If my memory, or information I have is correct, it seems that he went to Basra in 1916
Yeah, that's correct.
at the invitation
That is correct.
of the
Yeah,
British. But that's anyway. Now, if one looks at the overall picture of U.S.-Saudi relations, and I am to some extent interested in that. I would say that in your presentation, interesting as it certainly is, one can detect an imbalance. Okay, now this imbalance, I know you have a wide knowledge of the subject. Maybe the imbalance because you are talking to Arabian audience or some other reasons. But for example, you emphasized the benefits that Saudi Arabia got from the relationship with the U.S. and you talked about air conditioning and airlines and etc. Things that many people will say, and you said it actually, Pascal, that they will come anyway. I mean, this is part of the modern world, and it's part of what we call globalization process. So it's not, one cannot say that, underline or underscore them as really the benefits from the U.S., a close relationship with the U.S. But from a Saudi point of view, one could say that the U.S. really benefited. This is what I think you overlooked, maybe because of the time pressure. And I think the benefits that the U.S. got from a relationship with Saudi Arabia are of historic importance. There is an argument to be made, and someone I think is working on that now, that the whole project of reconstructing Europe after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan and its fallouts, the whole project of trying to reconstitute Europe so it will not fall into the hands of the communists was impossible without the underpricing of oil, without the cheap oil. And cheap oil certainly is unthinkable, I would say, without looking at U.S.-Saudi relations. There is a mutual interest in that, yes, but in the end, this relationship helped the U.S. not simply in the area here in the Gulf, but it had a more significant, more significant contribution, even to the most urgent problem that the U.S. faced after the Second World War, which is facing the communist enemy. Now, that's on the economic front. There is another dimension to combating communism, which is the main preoccupation for American national security, which is combating communism ideologically. And Saudi Arabia has been very beneficial in that, for mutual interest as well. It's very strange how people in the U.S. forget, and they talk about Wahhabism, if it's forgetting the uses that Wahhabism, so-called Wahhabism, was made to. But so I think it's important that we pinpoint these things. That okay, Saudis benefited definitely, but that Americans also benefited, and on a historic. On a historic scale, if one take the argument of an underpricing of oil for a long time seriously, and its effect on the capacity of the United States to work on reconstructing Europe after the war. So that's I think we need to emphasize that to keep the balance. My last point. Another point related to that. Now, you said that you are happy that we are talking about current relations, and when the current relations, one cannot help but struck by a paradox. On the one hand, that there are really serious serious and deep objective mutual interest between the two countries. And the elites in both countries understand that. Yet on the popular level, there is simply there isn't the sympathy, to put it mildly, for such a close relationship. Saudi bashing is probably never been worse, let's say, since before 9/11. I mean, post 9/11, probably a low point in that. And anti-Americanism is all and clear. It's clear for all to see. And this is a paradox. I think this is the major difficulty for anyone like yourself or myself or anyone else who is interested in seeing a good, close, healthy, balanced relationship between the two countries. That simply the popular base for it is very fragile, if not to say that it is rather hostile. Now, what to do about that? People usually, when this point is put across, they say, okay, we need more exchange. You know, we need to send Americans to Saudi Arabia so they can explain things to Saudi audience, and we need to send Saudis to the United States, and so to humanize the whole picture of the kingdom, etc. Now, I don't want to belittle this approach, but I think it reaped a very, very little fruits. I think a different approach is needed, and that is for Americans who are really interested in a healthy relationship with Saudi Arabia to address an American audience. And for Saudis who have the same concern about a good relationship with the US to address a Saudi audience. I mean, I really would have loved very much. I know you are active, but I take you as an example. Such lectures will be delivered in front of an American.
I do it all the time.
Yeah, I know. I'm not talking about you, President, but you get where I am getting at.
Of course.
Is that instead of Saudi, I mean, we can continue with that, exchange, etc., etc. I have nothing against that, but I think if we look at the record, for 30 years now we have been doing that. It's not only since James Oborezka, etc., etc. These projects have been going on, and the Americans have been coming, but yet the popular perception is getting negative, etc., etc. I think a different approach we need now for Americans to address an American audience, and for Saudis to address a Saudi audience in defense of, again, a healthy, balanced, mutually beneficial relationship. And thank you very much.
Let me address those as quickly as I can. On your third point about how the elites understand the benefits of the relationship and the masses don't, I think you're correct in almost all points on that. There are reasons for that, which we don't have time to go into here, but it's historically been true, and I think it's a problem that neither you nor we have found effective ways to deal with, and it's more important than ever that we do that. I concede that point. On the I think, though, I'm going to differ with you. And I certainly stipulate that this relationship has been beneficial to the United States in different ways from the way it benefited Saudi Arabia. I mean, eventually Saudi Arabia would have had air-conditioned buildings and railroads and all airplanes and all that stuff. Of course you would. Right. Saudi Arabia, to a certain extent, benefited from the American security relationship, right? Even though we never had a defense treaty, and we still don't. Right, and I stipulate that during the Cold War, Saudi Arabia, as an ideological and financial and strategic ally, was of huge value and importance to the United States. Sometimes in ways that we're still talking about today, as in Afghanistan. Right, maybe we'd both have been better off if we hadn't done that. Right, but I want to differ with you on the benefits derived from underpriced oil in projects such as the reconstruction of Europe. Saudi Arabia did not underprice its oil in the market in order to help the United States in any of our ventures. Saudi Arabia didn't control the price of its oil in those days, and neither did the other countries. The oil price was controlled by the external companies that dominated the market in the days before nationalization. And if the oil was underpriced, It's because Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran and Algeria and the other countries took what they could get from a market that was controlled by the international oil companies, not by you. So yes, we benefited, and in fact, I would say that even today we benefit from cheap oil. But I don't think, and we may have benefited from the fact that we got oil that was perhaps priced at less than its potential strategic asset value. But it's not because you did us a favor or did it to benefit us. It's because you didn't control the price of your own oil. So I would differ with you on that point.
Thank you. I go back to your subject, the history of the relation. Somebody asking, how do you judge the relation during Faisal era? How was it at the time? This is the question.
Right. In some ways, the Faisal era was the high water mark, the pinnacle of relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Faisal was a man who commanded immense respect. In some ways, it was a period of the greatest difficulty because of the 1973 war and the oil embargo. It was one of the few times when a leader of Saudi Arabia has felt the need to create an open breach with the United States because King Faisal felt that he had been misled by President Nixon about what was going to happen during that war. The king was perceived in the United States as the person who had, in this country, which was an important strategic ally, and pardon me for using blunt language, but King Faisal was perceived by the Americans as the person who had cleaned up the mess made by his brother, rightly or wrongly. Perceived as a strong leader of a country that we needed as an ally. He also perceived as somebody we could not control, as evidenced by the actions that he took at the time of the 1973 war. But what happened when the war ended and the Sinai ceasefire agreements were negotiated by Henry Kissinger was that King Faisal bore no grudges. He resumed a strong relationship with a valued ally, which we appreciated. And so that's my answer about where the relationship was in the time of King Faisal.
Thank you. This is a question that comes every time we have an American speaker.
I didn't do it.
It is
The CIA did it. I didn't do
it
it.
is hypocrisy of this American administration of the double standard in dealing with the issues. For example, now they are trying to help Darfuris to return home. But what about
Trying to help
doing
who?
the same, the Darfur
yeah.
Sudan, and not doing the same thing to the return of the Palestinian to their homeland? So it's a classic question.
It's a classic
I don't know if
question
you have
to
an
which the
answer.
answer is the same as it has been since 1948. You're absolutely right, and it's not going to change. And there are many reasons for this. You know, at one point, Colonel Eddy and King Abdulaziz had a long conversation on this very subject. And the king said, "What is it with you Americans? You stand up for freedom and the exiled and the oppressed all over the world. So what's different in Palestine? You stood up to fight for Greece and all these other countries. I mean, do you just not like Arabs, or what is it?" And Colonel Eddy gave him an explanation that I could give you today. Right? He said first that Americans don't know much about Arabs in general or Palestinians. They have this vague idea that while the Holy Land was in Arab lands, they didn't do in Arab hands. They didn't do much with it. To a greater to the extent that the Jews involved were Europeans, Americans had more of a common cultural heritage with them. The fact is that our religion, our food, our music, our art, and our literature came from Europe. They didn't come from the Arabian Peninsula. We lived among and with Jewish fellow citizens and Jewish friends. But there's something else, and that is that for better or worse, the Jews were better than the Arabs at political infighting in Washington. And in a lot of ways, they still are. It's just a fact of life. And so there were political reasons. This was not about economics. There were emotional reasons, and now it's just become sort of institutionalized. I don't believe you could do this. You could write this out in mathematical terms. You'd never come to an equal sign. The question is well taken, and I've been having this conversation for more than 30 years, and I'm never going to be able to resolve it myself.
Can I follow?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
What you said, the Jews are better at this, see, because they come out as Americans, and what we need, this is the point I was trying, is that for the American friends of the Arabs, or Americans who believe in a good relationship with the Arab people, and particularly Saudi Arabia, to come out and speak to the American public. You see, that's what is lacking. I don't know. Is it now it's considered politically suicidal for someone of his stature? This is a fact.
This is a very interesting phenomenon in American history, which I've learned a lot more about in the past couple of years. In the years between 1944 and 1948, when these decisions were being made, in the United States, the friends of the Arabs, the people who supported the cause of a unified Palestine against partition and against the Zionists, were by and large the social and economic and educational elite of the United States. They were people educated at Princeton and Yale and Dartmouth. They were Christians. They were economic blue bloods. And they were, for that very reason, not good at popular politics. The Jews were quite different. They grew up in America in a kind of blue-collar tradition that involved political street fighting at every level, municipal, state, and federal. Politics almost came naturally to them, so that the political capabilities of the Zionists and their friends far exceeded the political capabilities of the friends of the Arabs. The Arabs had friends who were the social, economic, and educational elite of the United States, the people you would most want to have dinner with, but they were not politically effective for that very reason.
Thank you. Before I conclude, and it's a personal inquiry in your research, it happened to study part of the beginning of Saudi-America relations, and you haven't mentioned the dealings that they had with King Abdul'Aziz through Charles Crane, the American industrialist,
Right.
who started, I think, 1926, these things. And I observed in some of the documentation, they were very serious to start this diplomatic relation at the time. I don't know if you dealt with it in your book or your research.
For those of you who aren't familiar with a gentleman named Charles Crane, Charles Crane grew up in Chicago as a rich kid whose family founded the Crane Plumbing Fixtures Company. They made toilets and sinks and bathtubs and made a huge fortune doing that. And he wasn't interested in that stuff. From an early age, he was interested in the Middle East. And at the end of World War I, when the conferees at Versailles were essentially dividing up the Ottoman Empire, and among other things, had to decide what to do about what was Ottoman-controlled Palestine, President Wilson appointed Charles Crane and another man named Henry King, the president of Oberlin College, to what became known as the King-Crane Commission. And basically, Wilson asked them to give me a report on what position I should take about the fate of Palestine. And they wrote a strongly worded report, which is very interesting reading today, that said that the Zionist project of a Jewish state in Palestine, as the fulfillment of the Balfour Declaration, can only be carried out by force, and it can only be carried out at the political and economic expense of the indigenous population. As often happens in history, no one paid any attention. And that's why the League of Nations gave the Palestine Mandate to Britain. They essentially kicked the ball 50 meters down the field so they wouldn't have to deal with it now. Right? Crane then became very interested in the Arab world, and he was one of the first Americans to meet King Abdulaziz. He came to Jeddah back in the 1920s. And at his expense, he sent a very well-known man at the time named Carl Twitchell on a geologic and engineering expedition around the country. Very arduous in those days to make such an expedition, to look for economic development and irrigation potential in Saudi Arabia. And I believe it's fair to say that it was Twitchell who first persuaded the king that there were oil possibilities in this country. Crane later took a similar interest in Yemen. And it was Crane, when President Roosevelt received that first letter from King Abdulaziz, he got a letter from Crane saying, "Mr. President, this guy is a real deal, and you ought to pay attention to him." Crane had quite a lot of influence in the early days. Right?
And that's what left a good impression with King Abdulaziz about the American.
Right.
That helped later.
Right.
Okay, thank you. وفي النهاية أشكر الجميع على الحضور, and I thank Mr. Thomas Lipman for his interesting comments and the presentations, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you all for your attention. Thank you for your hospitality.
Relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much.